So I am excited today to talk to Clair Minson, who is the founder and principal consultant of Sandra Grace LLC, which is a change management consulting firm specializing in issues of race, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the nonprofit sector, specifically in workplace development. Clair is also pursuing a Master's of Divinity at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. And of course, I always have to say that Claire is a West Indian sister. So yes. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. So tell us a little bit about yourself, personally and professionally.
Sure. Born and raised in Nassau, Bahamas. I've lived multiple lifetimes, though, in America. So my first iteration, I finished high school in Baltimore, so I can actually claim it as home. And then went to college in Atlanta, pursued a degree in psychology and criminal justice, moved back to the Bahamas, had a little person, moved back to America to do grad school, which I did, completed a degree in counseling. So I'm a licensed therapist in the state of Maryland, and then kind of fell into workforce development and fell in love with the work of supporting and helping people like reconnect with their identity and their skill set. And then moved into more intermediary capacity building because I wanted to think bigger and I wanted to impact the field. And that ended up looking like this intersection of racism and workforce development, and really examining those manifestations of racism and white supremacy culture in workforce development and supporting practitioners to like move away from that framing, which led me then to New Orleans for work full time. And then George Floyd was murdered, and well, everybody prior to George Floyd was murdered. And once we got to George Floyd and we were in the middle of the pandemic, I decided, you know what, I'm going to lean into consulting full time. And it's legacy for me. So Sandra Grace is my mother and my grandmother. And together their names mean brave defender of humanity with unmerited favor. And so that is how I lean into the work. And so right now I'm consulting full time, both locally and nationally, really internationally, with groups in the workforce development ecosystem who are at the very least aware that they need to do something different and help and different as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, racial equity, anti-racism, depends on where they are on the spectrum. And supporting their journey. So it's work that I am loving, and it's work that I feel called to do in addition to that in school full time, finally to I guess move into ministry. Like it still remains to be seen what that evolves into, but in seminary and answering that call as well.
I love that. Can you say again what the name Sandra Grace means?
Sure. Brave defender of humanity with unmerited favor.
Love that. Brave defender of humanity with unmerited favor. I love that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So I know you have a deep interest in Black liberation, anti-racism. That's sort of the foundation of your work. Would you tell us a little bit more about your work in this area? And please, share a little bit about how it relates to workforce development.
Sure. Gosh. Where to begin is the question. I will say that I'm on a journey, right, as it relates to really understanding what it means to be liberated, to be free, and then what it means personally, what it means to then support people and organizations to understand that and then operate from that framework, right, and want to support other Black people and non-Black people of color to their own liberation and freedom, or and support that journey. And you add in the Christian context. For me, my work and my authority to do this work in particular is driven directly from my faith, right? And where I see God as the God of the oppressed, right? God as a liberator, and I see justice, and I see that in the scriptures that I read, and I feel like I have then the authority to do this work in the way that I do it. And when I say to do this work, I mean specifically to name racism, to name injustice, to name oppression, and then to help people name it, and then identify strategies to undo the harmful practices that they are doing, right? And so liberation means, I guess if I had to define it, people who have been systematically and historically and currently oppressed get to define, right, like what their lives look like, the standards they want to live by, what success, if you will, what wealth, what all of that means for them, and not having to constantly prove their value, prove their worth, prove their dignity, and prove how they, merely exist in this world, that the skills that they have are recognized and valued, just as much as white people's skills are recognized and valued, right? And so that's how I would answer that, at least
Yeah,
to begin with.
I love that. Thank you. And so you mentioned a little bit about your faith, and I know that you are studying for the ministry. How does your ministry relate to Black liberation?
That's a great question. And again, still evolving, but I believe that my path is Black liberation theology. And so I've started delving into James Cone and reading God of the Oppressed and really trying to understand theologians like him who have really led the way in this discussion and this thinking. And then exploring what that means for me, exploring what unlearning I need to do, exploring the ways in which the church at large, the church as an institution and as an organization, and then the church as an organism, the people within it, have perpetuated harmful narratives, white supremacy culture, have upheld, racism, and then not figuring out what my role and responsibility is in disrupting. And so I do a lot of I do a lot of disrupting in school.
I love it. Talk about that.
Sure. I have a few professors. I have one professor in particular that has created space intentionally in her classes to have very intentional discussions about racism and oppression and the role that the church has played. And so her ability to create the space, one started with, she had us read Tears We Cannot Stop from Michael Eric Dyson for
Ooh,
class.
that's an intense book.
It was a gut punch. And then, so we read and we write and we talk about it. And so it was, and I was the only Black person in class. It was very interesting, to say the least. And I'm glad that she created the space to at least initiate and have the conversation and make people feel uncomfortable, sit in their discomfort. And it allowed me to use not only my personal voice, but some of my professional voice, if you will. Although that wasn't the intent of the space, so I had to be really mindful of the line there. But my disruption looks like, most recently naming that, my awareness of my responsiveness and the silence of my white peers during a discussion about racism and injustice in class. And if we can't have this conversation as we're on this ministry track, how are we going to support the communities right? Like when we're pastors, when we're Christian public leaders,
Right.
How will we then initiate the conversations when we're in a society where it's always been prevalent. We're not post-racial, we never have been, right? But like in a society where 1 year later, people are still traumatized, very triggered and traumatized from Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, whose death we just, acknowledged and recognized, and then George Floyd, right? Soon to be in May. So if we can't have the conversation, and it allowed some folks to say what their silence was about. And I mean, when I tell you stomach was in knots, right? Because I don't know how you're going to respond, but I can't sit in silence. And if I can model at least naming how I feel and like putting the thing on the table, then maybe somebody else will feel comfortable to do that too. And so those are the ways that I've tried, at least in that context, to disrupt and just put the thing on the table, say the thing, and then we figure out from there where to go.
Well, so you said something about the fact that you have things to unlearn as a Christian, a Black Christian woman. What sorts of things did you have to unlearn in order to lean into Black liberation as a Christian?
Yeah, so we were having a conversation recently in my pastoral care class about resilience and hope. And I struggled and had to name and actually had this realization during class that the ways in which the framing of resilience has been used against people who have been oppressed to say like, you can keep pushing forward. And really in some ways I connected it to this notion of exceptionalism, right? Like, they did it and you can push through, and like the whole concept around grit, right? And it totally negates the systemic oppression that we experience, right? It's from a white Western middle class framework that just does not acknowledge the very real systemic racism and oppression that Black people and other non-Black people of color experience. And so I had to sit within that class, like, oh my goodness, how have I contributed to this? How have I bought into this notion of resilience as it relates to this context, this Christian context specifically? And how have I encouraged others to be resilient in the faith without naming the structural and systemic challenges that they were facing, but couching it under Christianity and faith and love, right? It's
like victim blaming.
And victim blaming, right? But not even conscious that it's victim blaming. It's so, and that's just one example because it just happened last week that I had to really sit with. And thankfully there was another sister in the class that I could, like, I named it, right? And I named my gripe with the textbook, but also her and I were able to have a conversation that allowed me to say, okay, this isn't just me. I'm not making this up. And I'm also not, sometimes I can be conscious of, and I think some of this is related to just internalization, my own unlearning, right? Like, I'm not like playing the race card, if you will, right? I'm not like making up a thing. It really exists. This is a framing that matters. It's a real thing. And we've done so much harm. And so now what does it mean to undo that? I haven't gotten that far yet. I've gotten to like, oh my goodness, this is problematic. And I'm naming it in front of my peers. And now it's like, okay, what does that mean for how I offer pastoral care, particularly in a city like city like New Orleans, right? Where, Louisiana was home of segregation.
Oh, yeah.
And separate but equal. And what does that mean in a historically Black context with a white pastor and with gentrification all around? And like, what does that mean for how I provide pastoral care, when that day comes, and even in my ministry and context setting now? So that was a long answer, but that's what's top of mind when you ask that question.
Well, it's perfect, a perfect lead into my next question. And you've alluded to a little bit, but so personally for me, I have struggled with the church, right? I'm raised as a Christian, but really have struggled because I keep trying to find messages that talk about freedom from oppression for Black people and other non-Black people of color. But I feel like I keep hearing instead messages about forgiveness, acceptance, waiting for our rewards in heaven, turn the other cheek, blah, 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 blah. And it makes me wonder, in the moments when I am most vulnerable, I wonder whether or not Jesus supported racism. Does the Bible support racism? Because when I am at my most vulnerable around issues of race, I keep looking for a message from my faith community that says, but we're moving towards something different. And all I keep hearing is forgive, forgive, forgive. I don't always want to forgive.
Yeah.
I want justice.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I say, I see and read the Bible and God as a God of justice. And forgiveness has its place. It's funny because I was just reading one of my textbooks today, and is talking about forgiveness in this particular chapter. And actually, if you understand the historical context of forgiveness, to operate out of forgiveness was countercultural in Jesus's context, because to hold a grudge against someone was seen as to have power, and to offer forgiveness was seen as weak. But Jesus was saying, no, God has the power, right? And so your forgiveness is for you. It's not about this whole notion of who has power and who doesn't. That aside, so that's an interesting way to think about when I read the Bible, and I think about, like, particularly in the Old Testament, which is my favorite. You see that God is the God of the oppressed, right? Like, free my people, and I'm sending you as a prophet, right? To go and speak truth to power, to go and tell the people that they are wrong. I have a book that I'm going to send to you. It's called Opening Israel's Scriptures, that really digs deep into some of these prophets, the minor prophets, the latter prophets, who were really responsible for naming and like speaking truth to power about the injustices, about oppression, right? About like how the kingdoms were extracting labor. Like, that is a very real thing in the Bible, I don't believe for a second that Jesus was supportive of racism or supportive of oppression, because I don't see any proof of that. I know people try to make proof of it. They try to use the scriptures in that way, and lots of people do that. But I see God very clearly talk about justice and wrongdoing, right? And the people who are operating out of wickedness. And we know oppression is of the devil. Like, I'm real clear about that. Not everybody's clear about that. I'm clear about that. Me and the Lord had to talk about that. He made it real clear. Oppression is of the devil, right? And so if you understand it from that perspective and not trying to use it to manipulate a group of people, to manipulate a context to work in your favor, you can't be you just can't. People have done it. So I'm having two conversations in my mind, right? On the one hand, I want to say you cannot be a Christian for real, right? You can't be a Christ follower and operating out of oppressive practices, because he says, right, I came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. I came for you to be free, not to set the captives free, right? Not to hold the captives captive, if you will.
Right.
And so, I really struggle with I recognize people's fallacy, people's desire to be in power. And that is what has led them to use the Bible. And the church has supported, the church as an institution, I want to make that distinction, has supported and continues to support white supremacy and racism. And they have not yet been able to see that they are a tool of the enemy, simply put. And that's how I see it. Another living example, we were talking about, I think, Micah or Amos as prophets, and the People's Campaign, the pastor who leads the People's Campaign, I'm completely blanking on his name right now, as like a living prophet and speaking truth to power, right? And operating from what we see in the scriptures, in the Old Testament in particular, about how do we advocate for people and how do we make sure justice is served and we live from a perspective of justice. And so that's a faith that I believe in and ascribe to, and that I try to share with others. But you are right in that the church has been problematic. The church as both an organization and as the body, right? People as organisms have been completely problematic, and there's lots of undoing that needs to take place. And I think some people are making earnest efforts and others aren't.
Well, how do you respond to the criticism that white people taught Black people Christianity as a means of control?
I avoid that question. I have not given it enough intentional energy. And if I'm honest, because I know that there are going to be things that I have to grapple with in that. If I'm not mistaken, well, Christianity is born out of Judaism, right? Like, Jesus was a Jew.
Right.
And so lots of our religious practices, beliefs are based in Judaism and practices of Judaism. I don't know the church will ever admit that, but that's a whole nother layer.
Conversation.
Which we know have been around for years and years and years. I will say that they probably attempted to use Christianity to justify and to pacify and to, keep people enslaved. And there were folks who bought into it, and there were folks who didn't. When I think about Nat Turner and I think about Harriet Tubman, I see that they were clear that that was not the God that they served, and that was not the gospel that was true to them, and that directed what they decided, how they decided to live, and the uprisings and the Underground Railroad and all of that. And so I don't always answer it because I don't feel like I have a clear answer. I hold on to what I believe is my truth in that. And I think they attempted for sure. But I don't know that it was completely successful, and that's completely accurate. That's the best I can offer there.
No, I appreciate that. And I know that I am sort of pushing you to really sort of take a stance. And the truth is that for those of us who come from more collectivist societies, we understand the concept of both and, right? So
Right.
I hear what you're saying, that it could be true that both that our white slave owners really were using Christianity to subdue us. But I think the other side of that is we can all think of our matriarchs and patriarchs and
Mhm.
ancestors and elders who were able to hold on through difficult times
Yeah.
because of that faith. And
Yeah.
so maybe in some ways that faith is resistance.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
would agree with that completely. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the church were to move towards Black liberation, what would that look like? What would it look like for Christians to wholeheartedly adopt this side, Christians of all races? And then what would it look like for Black Christians?
Wow. That's a great loaded question, Wendy.
Sorry.
I mean, in some ways, I don't know that it changes from the earlier definition of liberation, right? Like Black people would be free to worship and fellowship and build community in ways that are true and authentic to them and authentic to their roots. I think it would mean recognizing and honoring our ancestors, and thinking about how to build in some of our ancestral religious practices as it relates to how we operate and live out our Christian faith and values, and not see them as in opposition, but hold them collectively. I think it would mean an acknowledgement that the church has been on the wrong side of history in many instances, not all, but in large part, and that repair would need to take place, whether in the form of like in formal apologies as well as some kind of reparations, right? I'm thinking about Adar's interview and equity. You can't have equity without repair has really stuck with me. And so it would mean some level of repair for Black Christians. We have our own work to do. So it would mean some intentional exploration for ourselves of what we've internalized that have been steeped in whiteness practices and whiteness norms and whiteness beliefs as it relates to the church context and how church is supposed to go, how you're supposed to show up in church. Perfect example. We're having a conversation yesterday at church, at outside church, and our director of music was like, when I grew up, you couldn't wear you couldn't show your sleeves in church, right? And there are some traditions that we are steeped in the Black church that are just like this, like, where do we get this from? It has to be steeped in these notions of what's right and what's professional, that's steeped in whiteness, right? And so like doing away with all of that and allowing ourselves to just show up as fully authentic and free, tapping into our ancestral roots, and not seeing it as a competition, right? Or either or, not having to feel the need to choose. It means it probably could really be a model, my God, for what it means to have a truly inclusive and welcoming community, right? People who actually lead with love. And what does it mean to lead with love? I mean, that was the greatest commandment, right? Like love of all the things. And what does it mean to embody that and live that and show that with one another? It really could be an example for what society and how society, right? Like if we really, really live the values, our Christian values in earnest, and we operated the way that Jesus did, right? Like Jesus was all about being countercultural, talking to the woman at the well. He wasn't supposed to be talking to no women, right? Like he was like, listen, I'm about saving your soul. I care about you. And I'm offering, I'm extending to you, no judgment, just all love. Just, like if we really live that, I think we could model what it could look like in society to have a just place, a just society, a loving, a welcoming, a caring, a no judgment, right? In terms of I'm right and these standards are norm, and everything else is not. Yeah.
I love the fact that you are pointing out that we should hold on to our ancestral faiths. I think for me growing up, there has been this feeling that, or this message that anything that is not of the white man's Christianity is of the devil. And I have struggled with that.
Me too.
And that, have you really?
Mm-hmm.
It's been some of my journey over the last couple of years, is to really understand where I learned that and what that really means. And as I grow, I begin to understand how much that way of thinking holds up white supremacy, because that's what the white man told us. The white man told us, get rid of everything that was from Africa, from where you came from, and accept only what I give you. And so part of my resistance has been really going back and sort of trying to understand um, what did my ancestors believe? What were their ways of thinking?
Yeah.
Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel it. I feel I have mixed feelings about it too, in that how will that disrupt what I know as my faith and what I've loved and believed about it? Or will it? Maybe it won't, right? But I have fears and trepidation about it, right? But I do believe that I do believe that we can learn from our ancestors. I do believe that there are practices that can be of value to us in today, right? As we think we're still navigating a very white dominant, white centric world, that could help us resist and can help us, move forward. I am at the place where I have friends who are exploring, like, what does ancestral altars look like, and what does it mean to have a dualistic faith, and what is all of that? And so I'm in a space where I want to know more, and I'm open to learning. I don't know how that will show up in my day-to-day practice, right, or in ministry context. But I don't know that I can do the work of Black liberation. I don't know that I can do the work of anti-racism without having some understanding of, historical understanding of who my ancestors were on the continent and how they lived out their faith and what that looked like for them and what were the practices. I don't know that I can talk about getting to Black liberation and not having an understanding, right, of what that looked like, whether or not I choose to embed those practices in my own faith journey, right? I don't know that I think I have to. I have a responsibility to.
Yeah, I'm in the same place. I just created my first ancestral altar, and I thought about it for a year and a half and had to overcome all of my feelings of what will the auntie say? What will so-and-so say? What will, sister so-and-so say, right? I had to overcome all of that before and I still, struggle with that. So another question for you is, well, two questions. Do you really believe that people of color, particularly Black people in this society, and white people can truly have multiracial, um, fully realized church communities where everybody is where the church as a whole, the community as a whole, is liberatory?
I think so. I do think so. I don't think it will be without challenges. I don't think it will be without, not only holding on to the values of the faith, but also holding on to the values of anti-racism and liberation, right? Like the two have to exist together, and there will be conflict. But I don't think conflict has to be negative or bad. I think it can be productive. I want to believe, let me say it this way, I want to believe that there can truly be a faith community, a Christian community, where Black people and white people can operate and live out liberatory practices and liberatory faith. I believe that the pieces are there, they exist. It's a matter of our willingness to actually lean into all of the discomfort and to the learning and unlearning that will be required, and to live out boldly. So I do believe, and I want to believe, and I think the pieces are there. We just have to want to do it.
Well, then, in order for that to happen, what would be the work for white Christians?
Child, they need to acknowledge that they have been complicit in the ways that they've been complicit, continue to be, historically have been. They will need to acknowledge and value Black people, and that we are created in the same image of God they created in, right? No less, no more. That repair is needed. That and name explicitly where the church has been harmful, the church as an organization and institution, and where the church as the body, white folk in the church, have been harmful, and that they commit to doing their work, not on the backs of Black people, but together. And then extending allyship or becoming co-conspirators in the journey. And honestly, we have to do our work too. This is not a conversation I say all the time publicly, but I've been thinking about it a lot, especially because in my day job, folks like to talk about Black people being in positions of leadership and authority, as if we haven't also been inculcated in, racist white practice norms. And so there's work that we as Black people have to do in recognizing the roles that we're playing if we're gatekeepers, or if we're truly disruptors, right? Or if we're just like, I'm just here because I need to survive. And I'm, whatever space we're in, we acknowledge that. Be willing to do our own unlearning, be willing to also extend an olive branch, and to recognize that mistakes will happen on the journey of learning and growth and community with other folk, mixed company, if you will. Yeah. So, but white people have to acknowledge, they have to name the role that they've played both individually and collectively. And they have to figure out what repair looks like, and what their ongoing work looks like. And then, wanting to build in partnership and not define, right? Not lead, not define, allow it to really be a partnership and shared power and shared decision-making, et cetera.
I would love to see that.
Me too. A girl could dream. A girl could dream.
We can dream. So then, how you've talked a lot about your hopes and your dreams for liberatory faith, liberatory Christianity. How do you find that balance between hope and the realities of fighting racism, the hope that comes with faith and the realities of day-to-day racism?
Yeah, I celebrate the small wins. I have to celebrate the small wins. And sometimes the small wins is personal, right? Sometimes the small win is like, I said that thing. Like, I said this thing to that person, and that was a win today. But I realize that if I don't celebrate the small wins and I tell other people to celebrate the small wins, it becomes overwhelming because it's big work, it's heavy, it's exhausting. Sometimes it's like, are we taking 10 steps backward? Like, are we going to talk about all these voter suppression bills? Like, is somebody going to, like, are we going to, like, what are we doing? Are we picketing? Come on now, right? Also thinking about and working with organizations who are saying they want to do the work, and they have like a real like moment that happens and they're willing to lean in and learn from it. It's like, I'm celebrating this win because, and I think that's the way that I hold on to hope, is because I focus on the daily wins and not just like on the mammoth of the problem, both society at large, but even in a particular group that I'm working with. And I think about, okay, where can I find the progress and how do I celebrate that? Because otherwise, I don't know that I would make it.
Yeah. No, I definitely understand that. I love this. This is great. Is there any final words that you would love to share? Thinking about all of these issues we're talking about?
It's funny that, I think about the work of anti-racism, and when I talk about it with others, I most often compare it to a faith journey and the steps that people need to take, because it is about transformation. And if you were like, your faith journey should be transformative, and in many instances it is for lots of folks. And so likewise, the steps that you take, the missteps that you take, right? Like the process is very similar to the work of anti-racism, and how the analogy that I use to help people like really understand what's required, like the individual work that's required for them to really lean into the journey. Because otherwise I find that folks want to focus on the external and they don't really want to do the internal work. And so I try to help them to connect to a similar process. So it could be faith, it could be dieting, right? It could be exercise, counseling, finances. The journey, oh Lord, right? Like the journey is similar, right? Yeah. And so that's what I would leave. It's a journey that we're all on. This conversation has left me with homework to do, so thank you. To do my own continued exploration and learning. But I'm with you in that if we could at least have conversations, right? If we can normalize some of these conversations, then I can continue to hope and dream that one day this will not be the context. One day we will really see liberation and freedom for Black people in particular.
Well, I'm going to leave it with those words. Someday we will see. I want to thank you so much, Claire, for joining. This was a great conversation, and I'm hoping that maybe we can come back. You can come back another time and talk about workforce and Black liberation, because I'm sure there's a lot to talk about there.
Yes, I'm with it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Wendy.